She poured my last glass before closing. I wasn't supposed to fall in love that night. 3 years later. A stranger's letter changed everything. My family thought they knew who I was. They were wrong about almost all of it. She had a secret older than our first kiss. I had to choose between her and my name. This is how a small wine bar broke me open. My name is Maya Ellison. And for 31 years I built a life engineered to please everyone but myself. I worked in commercial real estate in Portland, Oregon. Closing deals my father approved of. Dating men my mother liked. And quietly starving something I couldn't yet name. I told myself the ache was ambition. That the emptiness after every safe choice was just exhaustion. I didn't know a small wine bar 3 blocks from my office would eventually force me to stop lying to myself. The bar was called Amber and Vine. Tucked between a bookstore and a dry cleaner. Easy to miss unless you were looking for somewhere quiet to disappear after a brutal negotiation. I went in on a Tuesday because my last deal had collapsed, and I didn't want to go home to an apartment that felt more like a waiting room than a life. The woman behind the bar had dark hair pulled back messily, sleeves rolled to her elbows, and she looked at me like she'd already decided I needed something specific. "Rough day?" she asked, not looking up from the glass she was polishing. And I laughed before I could stop myself, surprised by how true the question landed. "That obvious?" I said, and she finally met my eyes, gray-green and unbothered, like she'd seen 100 versions of my exact exhaustion walk through that door. "You've got the face of someone who just apologized for something that wasn't your fault," she said, sliding a glass toward me. "This one's on the house. Trust me." Her name was Sloane Whitaker, and she owned the place outright. No partners. No investors. Just 5 years of savings and stubbornness poured into reclaimed wood and string lights. I came back the following week, telling myself it was because the wine was good, not because I wanted to hear her talk about grape varietals like they were old friends. By my 3rd visit, she remembered my order before I said it, a small thing that undid something tightly wound in my chest that I hadn't realized I was holding. "You're a creature of habit," she said one night, leaning on the bar. Same seat, same glass, same sad eyes around 8 o'clock. "What are you running from?" "Maya." I didn't answer her honestly that night. Instead I asked about the bar's name, and she told me her grandfather had planted vines in Sonoma before losing the land in a bad decade. "Amber and Vine," she said, "because everything worth keeping survives getting crushed first." I didn't know yet how much that sentence would end up describing both of us. Weeks passed before I admitted, even privately, that I was rearranging my schedule around her closing shifts, inventing reasons to walk past a street that wasn't on my way home. One night the bar was nearly empty, rain streaking the windows, and Sloane poured 2 glasses instead of 1 and sat down across from me like a customer for once. "I don't usually drink with people I'm serving," she said, "but you're the only regular who's never once talked to me like I'm just the help behind the counter." We talked until closing, about her failed culinary program, my father's real estate empire, the particular loneliness of building a life that looks perfect from every outside angle. I noticed the way she listened, fully, without checking her phone or waiting for her turn to speak, and it made me nervous in a way I didn't understand yet. "You're staring," she said, amused. And I looked away too fast, my face heating, feeling 19 years old instead of 31, feeling something I'd trained myself not to feel. I told her I was seeing someone, a man named Trevor my mother adored, and Sloane just nodded slowly. "Good for you," she said, but her voice had gone quieter. A month later she said my sister's name before I ever mentioned her, and the floor of the bar seemed to tilt slightly under my feet. "Ellison," Sloane said carefully, wiping down the counter that didn't need wiping. "There was a woman who used to come here years ago. Jenna Ellison." "Was she?" "My sister," I said, throat tight. "She died 4 years ago. Car accident on the Coast Highway." Sloane set down her rag and looked at me like the world had shifted. "She used to sit right where you're sitting," Sloane said softly. She talked about a little sister who was too scared to be honest with herself. I didn't know it was you. That night I learned my sister had been a regular here in her last year. That she'd known something about herself she never told our parents. Something Sloane had quietly guessed. She never said the word out loud. Sloane told me gently. But I've poured enough drinks for enough people to recognize the particular silence of someone hiding in plain sight. I went home that night and didn't sleep, staring at the ceiling, wondering how much of my sister I'd never actually known, and how much of myself I was still refusing to see. Trevor proposed 6 weeks later. On a rooftop my mother had helped him pick, with a ring my father had apparently approved of before I'd even seen it. I said yes because saying no felt like detonating a life I'd spent a decade constructing, brick by careful, dishonest brick, for people who would never live inside it with me. I didn't tell Sloane for 11 days. When I finally did, over a glass of Malbec, she went very still, then smiled in a way that didn't reach her eyes at all. "Congratulations," she said, and poured herself something stronger than wine. And I hated how much I wanted her to argue with me instead of wishing me well. I stopped going to Amber and Vine for 3 weeks, telling myself engaged women don't need wine bars, don't need Sloane's quiet attention, don't need whatever this had become. On the 22nd night I stood outside in the cold, staring through the window at her closing up alone, and I understood, with sudden brutal clarity, that I was in love with her. I didn't go in. I walked home in the rain instead, engagement ring cold against my finger, crying in a way I couldn't explain to anyone, least of all myself. Trevor noticed I'd been distant and asked if it was wedding stress. I told him yes, because the truth was a door I wasn't ready to open, not even a crack. I went back to the bar on a slow Sunday and told Sloane everything. The fear, the years of pretending, the way her voice had cracked something open in me I'd sealed shut long ago. "I think I've been lying to everyone my whole life," I said, including myself. "And I don't know how to stop without losing everyone I love." Sloane didn't say anything for a long moment. Then she reached across the bar and covered my hand with hers, warm and steady, and said, "Start with just one true thing." "I don't think I'm supposed to marry Trevor," I whispered. The first honest sentence I'd said aloud in years, and Sloane's eyes filled before she blinked it away. "Professional again. That's not my business to weigh in on," she said carefully, pulling her hand back. "But I'm glad you said it, even quietly, even just to me." I broke off the engagement 2 weeks later, in Trevor's apartment, watching a good, kind man's face fall as I failed to give him a reason that made any sense to him. My mother called it a breakdown. My father called it selfish. Neither of them asked the real question, the one that would have required them to actually see me. I went to the bar the night I moved my things out of Trevor's place, exhausted and untethered, and Sloane locked the door early and just held me while I cried. "I'm not asking you for anything," she murmured into my hair. "I just don't want you to fall apart alone tonight. That's all this is. You don't owe me anything." But something had shifted between us, unspoken and enormous, and when I finally pulled back to look at her, neither of us moved away fast enough to pretend otherwise. "Maya," she said, my name a warning and an invitation at once, and I closed the distance and kissed her before either of us could talk ourselves out of it. She kissed me back like she'd been waiting years, one hand cradling my jaw. And for the first time in my adult life I stopped thinking and simply felt something fully. We pulled apart, both breathing hard. And Sloane laughed shakily. "I have been very professional for a very long time," she said. "I'd like that to be over now." "Please," I said. And she laughed for real this time, and locked the front door properly. And we stayed until the streetlights outside flickered off at dawn. For the first time I understood what my sister must have felt. That terrifying, expansive relief of finally being exactly who you are in front of another living person. I didn't tell my parents yet. I told myself I needed time, but really I was afraid. And Sloane, patient in a way I didn't deserve, never once pushed me to hurry. We kept things quiet for months, meeting after her closing shifts, walking through empty Portland streets like teenagers sneaking around a curfew neither of us had agreed to obey. My mother started asking pointed questions about why I seemed happier despite the broken engagement, and I deflected with vague answers about therapy and self-care. Technically not lying. Sloane's business partner from years ago, a man named Derek, resurfaced asking to buy back into Amber and Vine, and I watched her jaw tighten every time his name came up. He left when things got hard, she told me. Now the neighborhood's gentrifying and suddenly he remembers he loves wine culture. I don't trust people who show up for the easy part. I offered to review the buyback contract using my real estate background, and Sloane hesitated before handing it over, admitting she hated feeling like she needed anyone's help. You don't need my help, I said. You're allowed to want it anyway. Those are different things. And I think you deserve to let someone in occasionally. The contract was predatory, structured so Derek could seize majority control within 18 months. I told her to refuse it, and relief crossed her face like sunlight through storm clouds. My father found out about Sloane by accident, seeing us through the bar window during a business dinner across the street. His expression frozen into something I'd never seen before. He didn't say anything that night, but 2 days later he called and asked me, voice flat, "Is there something you need to tell your mother and me?" Maya. I sat in my car outside my apartment for 40 minutes before I could answer him. I'm seeing someone, I finally said. Her name is Sloane. I love her. The silence on the line stretched so long I thought he'd hung up. We'll discuss this in person, he said instead. And the call ended before I could say anything else. That Sunday dinner was the worst 2 hours of my adult life. My mother crying quietly into her napkin. My father lecturing about legacy, reputation, and the family name. This isn't a phase, I told them, voice shaking but steady. This is the first honest thing I've done in years. I'm sorry it disappoints you, but I won't apologize for it. My father said the word unnatural, and something in me went cold and clear, like ice forming over still water, protecting whatever was underneath from further damage. Jenna would have understood, I said quietly, and my mother's face went white, like I'd said something forbidden, something they both worked very hard never to discuss. Don't bring your sister into this, my father snapped. Too fast. Too sharp. And I realized with sudden dread that there was more buried here than I understood. I left that dinner without answers, only new questions, and a growing, uneasy sense that my sister's secret had been bigger and sadder than a bar owner's careful hints suggested. At work, rumors started circulating after a colleague saw me leaving Amber and Vine holding Sloane's hand. My biggest client, a conservative developer, requested a different account manager the following week. My boss called me into his office, not to fire me, but to suggest I keep my personal life more private if I wanted to make partner before 40. I told Sloane about it that night, and she went quiet, guilt flickering across her face. I'm costing you things, she said. Your family. Your career. I hate that. You're not costing me anything, I said firmly. Every one of those things was built on me hiding. I'd rather have less and have it be real. She didn't fully believe me. Could tell. And something protective and stubborn in her started pulling back slightly, like she was bracing for me to eventually choose the safer life. Derek returned with a harder offer, revealing he had a silent investor backing a plan to buy the entire building and evict Amber and Vine within the year. Sloane spent 3 sleepless nights trying to find the investor's identity, calling every contact she had, growing more frantic and exhausted with each dead end she hit. I offered to use my real estate connections to trace the LLC behind the offer, and after 2 days of digging, I found the ownership records buried in a shell company. The registered agent's address matched a law firm I recognized instantly, because I'd sat in their conference room a dozen times beside my own father. My hands were shaking when I called him. Are you the investor trying to buy Sloane's building? Asked. And his long pause answered before his words did. It's business. Maya, he said calmly. Nothing personal. That block is undervalued. I'd have made this offer regardless of who runs the wine bar on the corner. You're lying, I said. Voice breaking. You're doing this because of her. Because of me. Tell me the truth for once in your life. He didn't deny it a second time. And that silence told me everything. Confirming that my father was willing to destroy Sloane's livelihood to punish me for loving her. I told Sloane the truth that night. Watching her face shift from confusion to devastation to a cold, controlled fury I hadn't seen from her before. Your own father, she said quietly, staring at nothing. He'd take my whole life away just to prove a point about who you're allowed to love. I won't let him, I said, and meant it more fiercely than I'd meant almost anything. Feeling something in me finally choose a side. Permanently. Without hesitation, Sloane pulled away instead of leaning in, wrapping her arms around herself. Maybe you should let him, she said. Maybe this is too much collateral damage for one relationship. Don't do that, I said. Don't decide I'm not worth fighting for before I've even had the chance to fight. But she was already retreating behind old walls. I've been left before. Maya, she said, voice cracking. By someone who chose her family over me. I can't watch that happen twice. I won't survive it twice. That was the first time she'd mentioned an ex directly. And something in her tone told me this wound went far deeper than a simple bad breakup. Tell me, I said gently. And after a long silence, Sloane finally told me about Rachel. The woman she'd been engaged to 5 years before I ever walked through that door. We were together 3 years, Sloane said. Then her parents found out. Threatened to cut her off completely. And she chose the inheritance and a husband named Paul instead. She sent a wedding announcement, Sloane said flatly. Like that was a normal thing to send someone whose heart you just ended. I built this bar out of that wreckage. I'm not Rachel, I said, reaching for her hand. But Sloane flinched back. Not cruelly. Just instinctively. Like an old injury being touched by accident. You don't know that yet, she said. Neither do I. And I'm too tired to find out the hard way again. I think we should slow down. Maya. I went home that night feeling like the ground had opened beneath me. Terrified I was about to lose the first honest thing I'd ever built for myself. My mother called the next morning. Her voice different. Quieter. Asking if she could see me alone. Without my father. And something in her tone made me agree immediately. We met at a diner neither of them would ever normally choose. And she sat across from me twisting her wedding ring. Working up to something she'd clearly rehearsed. Your grandmother left me a box before she died, she said. I never opened it until last week. I think you need to see what's inside it. Maya. Inside was a bundle of letters. Decades old. Written to a woman named Eleanor. Signed only always. See. My mother's hands trembled as she watched me read them. Your grandmother loved a woman named Eleanor Price for 30 years, my mother said quietly. She married your grandfather because her family gave her no other choice. She never stopped loving her, my mother continued. I found out by accident when I was 17. I promised her I'd never tell your father. I've kept that promise for decades. Jenna found the letters too, my mother whispered. Tears finally falling. That's why she went to that bar so often. She was trying to understand herself through them. The pieces clicked together with painful clarity. My sister's secret visits. Sloane's careful recognition of her. A family history of hidden love stretching back generations before me. I should have told your father the truth about all of it years ago, my mother said. Instead I watched him nearly ruin your happiness the same way his silence ruined Jenna's. Are you saying you support this? I asked carefully. And my mother reached across the table and took both my hands in hers. Something she hadn't done in years. I'm saying I spent 30 years watching your grandmother's eyes go distant every anniversary, she said. I won't watch that happen to my own daughter. Not again. I asked her to help me stop my father's takeover of Amber and Vine, and to my surprise, she agreed without hesitation, already reaching for her phone to make calls. My mother, turned out, controlled a trust from her own late mother, untouched by my father's finances, and enough capital to outbid his shell company entirely if needed. "Let me help," she said. "Not because I fully understand everything yet, but because I refuse to let fear do to you what it did to your grandmother and your sister." I went back to Sloane that night with the letters and the truth, hoping it would be enough to bridge the distance that had opened between us. She read the letters slowly, and when she finished, she looked up at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Somewhere between grief and cautious hope. "This doesn't undo what your father's trying to do to my business," she said carefully. "But it explains something about why you were always so afraid to be seen." "I'm not afraid anymore," I said. "Or I am. But I'm choosing you anyway. I just need you to stop deciding I'll leave before I've had the chance to prove I won't." Derek escalated the pressure, threatening a lawsuit over a minor lease clause, timing it deliberately to coincide with the busiest week of the bar's annual wine festival. Sloane worked 18-hour days trying to save the festival while fighting legal threats, and I watched exhaustion carve new lines into a face I'd come to memorize. I took 2 weeks off work to help her, drafting counter notices, calling contract attorneys, doing everything my real estate training had prepared me for except this deeply personal. My father showed up at the bar unannounced one evening, ostensibly to talk business, but really to see if his pressure campaign had already broken us apart. "You look tired, Maya," he said, surveying the room with cold calculation. "This isn't the life I raised you for. It's not too late to walk away clean." "I am walking toward something for the first time in my life," I said. "You're the one standing still, holding on to a version of me that never actually existed." He left without another word, but I saw something flicker in his expression. Not quite doubt, but the first crack in a certainty he'd carried my whole life. A rival wine bar chain, funded quietly through connections to my father's real estate firm, opened 2 blocks away, undercutting prices and clearly targeting Sloane's regular customers. Sloane started losing sleep entirely, snapping at staff, pulling away from me in small painful increments, convinced she was about to lose everything she'd spent 5 years building. "Maybe I should sell to Derek," she said one night. Defeated. "Take the money. Walk away. Start over somewhere your father's reach doesn't extend. Somewhere simpler than this." "That's the fear talking." "Not you," I said. "You built something real here. I won't let my family's cruelty be the reason you abandon it. We'll find another way." My mother, working quietly behind the scenes, discovered that my father's shell company had violated a zoning disclosure requirement, technically invalidating his purchase offer entirely. She presented the evidence to him privately, along with an ultimatum I never fully learned the details of, but that visibly shook something loose in him overnight. 2 days later, my father withdrew his offer on the building without explanation, and Derek, losing his silent backer, quietly abandoned his lawsuit and buyback attempt as well. I should have felt relief, but instead I felt hollow, knowing the crisis had passed only because my mother fought a battle my father should have never started. Sloane and I should have been closer after the danger passed, but instead the accumulated stress finally cracked something between us that had been strained too long. 1:38 We had our first real fight. About nothing and everything. About fear and trust and how many times she expected me to eventually disappear like Rachel had. "I'm not going anywhere," I shouted, frustrated and hurt. "Why can't you believe that? Why do I have to keep proving it to you every single day?" "Because love left me broke and humiliated once already," she shouted back. "Forgive me for needing more than words this time, Maya. Forgive me for being afraid." We didn't speak for 6 days, the longest silence since the night we first kissed, and I spent every one of them convinced I'd lost her permanently. My mother, of all people, was the one who finally pushed me to go back, sitting me down and telling me love worth keeping requires more courage than pride. Your grandmother waited 30 years for a letter she never sent, she said. Don't be the second generation of this family to lose someone out of stubbornness. Maya. I went to the bar on the 7th night, terrified she wouldn't be there. But she was sitting alone at a corner table, staring at an unopened bottle. I've been rehearsing an apology all week, I said, sitting across from her. But I think what I actually need to say is simpler than that. I choose you, I said. Not because it's easy, not because my family finally approves, but because you are the truest thing that's ever happened to me. Sloane's eyes filled, and for a long moment she didn't speak, just reached across the table and laced her fingers through mine like she was relearning how to trust. I choose you too, she finally whispered. I'm sorry I keep bracing for you to leave. Rachel taught me to expect it. You keep teaching me otherwise. We were fragile after that, rebuilding slowly. But something steadier had taken root. Something that felt less like infatuation and more like a foundation neither of us wanted to lose. 3 months later, Sloane asked me to help plan Amber and Vine's 5th anniversary event, the first real celebration since the crisis with my father and Derek. I spent weeks quietly organizing it, inviting her regular customers, ordering a cake from the bakery next door, wanting to give her the joy she'd sacrificed for months. The night of the event, the bar filled with warm light and familiar faces, and for the first time in a long while, I watched Sloane genuinely relax. My mother came, unannounced, standing awkwardly near the door until Sloane crossed the room and hugged her. Something neither of us had expected but both desperately needed. Thank you for helping save this place, Sloane told her quietly, and for raising someone brave enough to walk through my door on a Tuesday night 3 years ago. My mother cried and admitted, in front of both of us, that she wished she'd had the courage decades ago to fight for my grandmother's happiness the way she'd fought for mine. Midway through the celebration, an unfamiliar woman walked in, hesitating near the entrance, and I watched Sloane's entire posture change, going rigid, her smile faltering instantly. Rachel, Sloane said quietly, and the name landed in my chest like a stone dropped into still water. Sudden and unwelcome and impossible to ignore. Rachel approached carefully, apologetic, explaining she'd heard about the anniversary from a mutual friend and wanted, after all these years, to finally say something honest. I've thought about you every day since I left, Rachel told Sloane, voice unsteady. My marriage ended 2 years ago. I've been trying to work up the courage to find you. I felt something cold twist in my stomach, an old fear resurfacing, wondering if history was about to repeat itself in the worst possible way. Right in front of me. Sloane was quiet for a long moment, studying Rachel's face like she was looking at a photograph of someone she used to be, someone who no longer existed. I forgive you, Sloane finally said, but I'm not the person you left anymore. And I'm not available. Rachel. I'm genuinely, completely happy with someone else now. She reached for my hand as she said it, deliberately, publicly, in front of everyone. A small unmistakable declaration that settled every doubt I'd been carrying. Rachel's face fell, but she nodded, offering a quiet, gracious apology before leaving. And something in Sloane visibly loosened, an old wound finally, fully closing over. I needed to see her again to know I wasn't still waiting, Sloane told me later. Turns out I stopped waiting the night you walked into this bar. A week after the anniversary, Sloane discovered an anonymous wire transfer had paid off the remaining balance on her original business loan, erasing years of debt overnight. The bank could only tell her the payment came from a private trust, not affiliated with any commercial entity, requesting complete anonymity from the person behind it. I had my suspicions, and when I gently pressed my mother, she finally admitted, smiling faintly, that she'd used part of my grandmother's untouched inheritance to fund it. Call it overdue reparations, my mother said. For 30 years of silence. And for almost letting your father cost you the kind of love your grandmother never got to keep. Sloane cried when she found out. Overwhelmed. Insisting it was too much. And my mother simply told her. You kept my daughter honest. That's worth more than money. My father requested a meeting alone with me. The first time he'd asked to see me privately since the dinner where everything had first cracked open between us. We met at his office. And he looked older somehow. Smaller. Like the certainty he'd carried my whole life had finally worn down under its own weight. I read the letters your mother found, he said quietly. I didn't know about your grandmother. I didn't know what I was repeating when I threatened Sloane's business. That's not an excuse, I said. But I'm listening. He nodded, accepting the correction without argument. Something I genuinely never witnessed from him before. I was wrong, he said, the words visibly costing him something. About the business. About Sloane. About you. I'd like the chance to know my daughter honestly. If you'll allow it. It wasn't a full reconciliation. Not yet. But it was a door left open where I'd expected only a permanently locked one. And I walked out lighter than I'd entered. I told Sloane about the meeting that evening. And she listened carefully. Then asked the question I hadn't let myself ask yet. Do you think you can forgive him? Eventually, I said. Not today. But I don't want to spend my whole life the way my grandmother did. Loving someone in secret and calling it acceptance. 6 months into fully living openly, my company passed me over for the promotion I'd been promised, citing cultural fit concerns in language too careful to be actionable. I sat with the unfairness for exactly 1 week before deciding I no longer wanted to build my career around people who required me to shrink myself to be valued. Sloane, without me asking, offered me a partnership stake in Amber and Vine, using my real estate and negotiation skills to help her finally expand to a second location. I'm not doing this because I feel sorry for you, she said, laughing at my raised eyebrow. I'm doing it because you're brilliant. And I want you here permanently. I left corporate real estate 3 weeks later, terrifying my old colleagues and delighting exactly no one in my father's social circle, and felt, for the first time, entirely unburdened. We spent the following months scouting locations together, arguing over lease terms and wine lists with the easy familiarity of two people who trusted each other completely now. My mother started visiting the bar every Sunday, bringing my grandmother's old recipe cards, insisting Sloane try recreating dishes Eleanor apparently used to cook for her decades earlier. It feels like closing a loop somehow, my mother said one evening, watching Sloane experiment in the small kitchen. Like I'm finally finishing something your grandmother never got to. My father came to the bar for the first time on my birthday. Stiff and uncomfortable, but present, ordering a glass of the Cabernet Sloane recommended without complaint. It's good, he admitted grudgingly. And Sloane smiled at me over his shoulder. And I realized I no longer needed his full acceptance to feel completely whole. A journalist writing about generational LGBTQ history in Portland heard about my grandmother's letters through a mutual contact and asked to feature our family's story. I hesitated, protective of my grandmother's privacy even in death. But my mother encouraged me, saying Eleanor deserved to finally exist somewhere other than a hidden box of letters. The article ran with photos of the old letters alongside a current photo of Sloane and me at the bar. 3 generations of the same quiet courage finally made visible. Readers began showing up at Amber and Vine specifically because of the story, some of them sharing their own hidden family histories, their own quiet decades-old secrets. An elderly woman came in one afternoon, hands shaking, holding a faded photograph. I think I knew your grandmother, she said. I think I might be Eleanor's niece. We spent hours with her that evening, piecing together a family history none of us had known existed. Another thread connecting my grandmother's buried love to the present moment. She never stopped talking about a woman named Constance, the niece said, using my grandmother's real first name. I always wondered who she meant. Now I finally know. I asked my mother if she wanted to meet the woman formally. And she agreed immediately, saying Eleanor's family deserved to know Constance had loved her until the end. The two families met the following month. An unexpected reunion built from secrecy, tragedy, and finally, decades later, the simple relief of being spoken about honestly. Sloane proposed on the 1-year anniversary of the night I finally chose to stay instead of walking away. In the same corner booth where we'd first reconciled. I know we've only been official a year, she said, hands shaking slightly, but I've loved you since the night you told me your sister's name. Marry me. Maya. I said yes before she'd even finished the sentence, and the small crowd of regulars who happened to be there that night erupted into applause and happy tears. My father, present for the first time at something so intimate, raised his glass and offered a toast, awkward but sincere, welcoming Sloane properly into the family. My mother cried through the entire toast, holding tightly to one of my grandmother's old letters, finally able to celebrate a love story that got to survive. We were married the following spring in the small garden behind Amber and Vine. String lights overhead. Wine from Sloane's grandfather's old vineyard poured for every toast. My father walked me partway down the aisle. An imperfect gesture from an imperfect man trying, visibly and finally, to become someone worthy of both his daughters. I thought of Jenna throughout the ceremony, wishing she'd lived long enough to walk through this same door, to sit in this same garden, to be fully known and loved. My mother read one of my grandmother's old letters aloud during the reception, her voice steady, finally giving Constance and Eleanor's love story the audience it deserved. Sloane and I opened the second Amber and Vine location that same year, dedicating a small corner shelf to my grandmother's recipe cards and a photo of two women, standing behind the bar together on opening night, pouring wine for strangers and friends alike. I finally understood what Sloane meant about everything worth keeping surviving being crushed first. I used to think love meant disappearing quietly into other people's expectations, but Sloane taught me it means staying loudly and completely, exactly as yourself. Some nights I still catch her watching me across the bar the way she did that very first evening, and I think, finally, honestly, I am exactly where I belong. Vandy.